Hello, I'm Sophie Volp, Chair of the Center for Chinese Studies. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate the life and work of Janet Theiss. Janet was a distinguished historian of late Imperial China who earned her PhD from UC Berkeley's History Department in 1998. Her book, Disgraceful Matters, The Politics of Chastity in 18th Century China, examined how Qing legal and ritual practice shaped notions of virtue, gender, and state power. She also co-edited Gender in Modern East Asia, which examines the history of woman and gender in China, Japan, and Korea from the 17th century to the present. Janet was known for her rigorous archival scholarship and generosity as a mentor and colleague. She left a lasting legacy in Chinese legal and gender history. She taught Chinese history at the University of Utah for 28 years, and colleague after colleague has spoken of their admiration for her leadership in the field. With her friend Toby Meyer-Fong, Janet co-edited the flagship journal of Qing Studies, Late Imperial China, and she co-led the Society for Qing Studies as well. She headed the East Asian and Inter-Asian Council for the Association for Asian Studies, and she founded the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Utah and led it for years. We had a chance to hear Janet's research presented at Berkeley in May of 2024 when she spoke about her second book project in a talk entitled Haunting Loyalties, The Making and Unmaking of an Early Qing Family. We now have two funds at Berkeley that commemorate Janet's many decades of connection to Berkeley, one which supports early career scholars in Chinese legal and gender history, and one which provides support to the Center for Chinese Studies. Before we introduce the panelists, I'd like to thank Wenxin Ye, the Richard and Laurie C. Morrison Chair Professor and Distinguished Professor of History, for her thoughtful and generous support of our commemoration of Janet's work. Wenxin has been central at every step of the planning and execution of this event, and she's really been integral to its realization. So thank you, Wenxin. So I will call speakers up two by two. Our first two speakers are Melissa Macaulay and Matthew Sommer. Melissa Macaulay earned her PhD from Berkeley in 1993 and is the Wayne Jones II Professor in History at Northwestern University, specializing in late Imperial and modern Chinese history. Her research focuses on such topics as the interrelated history of southeastern China and Southeast Asia, colonialism and imperialism in East and Southeast Asia, and legal culture in Chinese social history. She's the author of Social Power and Legal Culture, Litigation Masters in Late Imperial China, and Distant Shores, Colonial Encounters on China's Maritime Frontier, which received the Bentley Book Prize from the World History Association. Matthew Sommer is a social and legal historian of China in the Qing dynasty. His research focuses on gender, sexuality, and family, and the main source for his work is original legal case records from local and central archives. He's the author of Sex, Law, and Society in Late Imperial China, Polyandry and Wife Selling in Qing Dynasty China, Survival Strategies and Judicial Interventions, and most recently, The Fox Spirit, The Stone Maiden, and Other Transgender Histories from Late Imperial China. So Melissa and Matt, do you want to come up? And then when you're done speaking, we will introduce Ili Wu and Eugenia Menegon. Thanks.
So I'm Melissa, not Matt. Let me begin by thanking everyone at Berkeley for organizing this event, especially Sophie and Wenxin, as we gather to celebrate and appreciate the life and scholarship of Janet Theiss, a dear friend and a leading authority on late Imperial China. This was so unexpected that I'm really grateful for this opportunity to gather with friends and associates of Janet to celebrate her memory. Janet and I went to graduate school here at Berkeley. We were friendly at the time, but we weren't particularly close in those days because I was a few years ahead of her, and I headed off to do my dissertation research in the early 90s in China just as she was arriving. And then I came back after an extended stay there, and then she ended up going off to China. So our time here didn't entirely coincide. We actually became much better friends because we both ended up in late Imperial Chinese history, and Janet became a leader in our field. not only because she and her dear friend Toby Meyer Fong took charge of our flagship interdisciplinary journal, Late Imperial China, but also because they helped revive the Society for Qing Studies and organize so many events and programs that kept the study of late imperial China in the forefront of the China field. I suspect I don't need to tell the members of her family that Janet was an organizer. She's precise. She focuses on the essentials. She reads people well. She knows how to plan and set goals. And she turned out to be a phenomenal administrator. I can assure you they do not train us in that skill at graduate school, certainly at Berkeley, I have to say. But she turned out to be a truly exceptional academic administrator, and the rest of us in the late imperial field benefited from her talents, as did the people at the University of Utah. And that, of course, points to one of her standout personality traits. She really gave more than she took. She and Toby kept the journal going through some pretty challenging days. And Janet's contributions to the Association for Asian Studies also were notable. A quick reading of her CV reveals an enormous amount of dedicated service to the field at the local and national levels. Today, however, I would like to talk about her scholarship, which was pioneering and, in fact, brilliant. Others here today will likely focus on her contributions to the study of gender, but she and I became closer friends because we ended up working in the same field initially. Neither one of us called it legal history per se, though that in part was what we worked on. We became committed to a larger project that might be called the social history of legal culture. Or perhaps a better way to frame it was that we were trying to study how legal sources enabled us to engage in social history. And in her case, of course, it was the social history of gender, women, and the family. Our early days coincided with extraordinary moments in the American study of Chinese history. The first was the opening of the Chinese archives to American historians. This happened, of course, a bit before our time, of course, but in the 70s, for example, the 70s were marked by some Communist Party resistance to the scholarly exchanges that were being set up. The Chinese government was happy to see exchanges in the natural sciences, but were unnerved by the fact that social scientists and historians accompanied the American scientists. My favorite story was when the historian Lloyd Eastman and the economist Ramon Myers accompanied a group of American agronomists to Beijing in 1976, and the government complained that the two scholars, quote, didn't know anything about wheat. But by the time Janet and I were hitting the archives in the late 1980s and early 1990s, American research on late imperial and modern Chinese social history was thriving and relatively unencumbered. The Qing archives, then located in the Forbidden City, were the perfect repository for the sort of work on gender and the family that Janet pursued. And Janet proved to be a master of the archives. The other extraordinary moment I would like to elaborate on was the scholarly and intellectual world of Berkeley when Janet and I were both graduate students from the late 1980s through the 1990s. We experienced firsthand how the cultural turn was affecting the interdisciplinary study of human society across the disciplines at Berkeley. And Berkeley was at its vibrant, boisterous, and infuriating best at that time. And it was a very exciting time to be a graduate student here. I'm seeing a few nods of the fellow old folk here. We entered that world as students trained in social history, more or less. Janet was trained as an undergraduate at Swarthmore by an exceptional scholar of many exceptional scholars, but also an exceptional scholar of social and economic history, Lillian Lee. Certainly when I started at Berkeley in 1984, many of the senior faculty, including my own advisor, Fred Wakeman, identified themselves as people who specialized in social history. And it may be unfair to describe it so simplistically, but that generation was galvanized by a spirit articulated by E.H. Carr long ago that, quote, the more sociological history becomes and the more historical sociology becomes, the better for both. Which is basically true, I think. But those older scholars historians were part of a longstanding project to promote history from below and to place social history at the forefront of the discipline. Now, that world still existed when we arrived at Berkeley, but it was changing, and was changing even before I arrived. The cultural turn in history, or the new cultural history as it was called, was affecting many universities, but it seemed to affect the history department at Berkeley in highly productive ways. And Wen Xin is probably better qualified to describe these changes because they started during her own years here of graduate study here. But I think that the cultural turn in history was so productive at Berkeley because many of its advocates were among the leading historians of their generation. They could not be dismissed as mere theorists or flakes or anything like that. I'm thinking mostly of people like Natalie Davis, whose own line in French history was then filled by her successor, Lynn Hunt. But there were others, Tom LaCour, Randolph Starn, and so on. And these scholars inaugurated some of the most important institutions that helped shape the emergence of an empirically sound form of cultural history. In 1984, UC Press invited Lynn Hunt and the sociologist Victoria Bonnell to start the series, Studies on the History of Society and Culture. And as the two scholars wrote in their original declaration of the series' goal, I quote, the editors hope to encourage the publication of books that combine social and cultural modes of analysis in an empirically concrete, yet theoretically informed fashion. The concept of culture is understood here in the broadest sense to encompass the study of mentalities, ideologies, symbols, rituals, and high and popular culture. And many of these historians joined with art historians and literary specialists or scholars at Berkeley to launch the journal Representations in 1982, a journal based in Berkeley that declares on its current masthead that, quote, Representations publishes sophisticated, highly readable essays on the workings of culture, both past and present. Long known for its innovative essays on art, intellectual and legal history, science and gender studies, theories of history, and literary phenomena, Representations' reach extends as well to such topics as the history of emotions, national identity, new media, and the renewal of aesthetics in criticism. Representation provides a forum for work that is theoretically sophisticated, but with a high degree of social, historical, and textual specificity. End of quote. Now, most social historians were reluctant to lean into literary theory, which was part of this representations ethos, but otherwise engaged in the sort of discourse analysis that involved the brutal scrutiny of historical documentation, including archival sources, and it pushed beyond what Natalie Davis referred to as fiction in the archives. The challenge in those days was to combine empirically rigorous research and exposition with an ability to decipher cultural meaning. Now, all of this is very old hat now, but it was new and refreshing and intellectually challenging when Janet and I started our graduate studies at Berkeley. I think it accounts for some of the similarities in our methodological approaches in the study of legal history, especially the interest in understanding China's legal culture in terms of the problem of legal scandals, or how legal scandals might have shaped human understandings of their society. So Janet was a master of this sort of history I'm describing that was really bubbling to the fore at Berkeley at that time. She was a superlative archival researcher with a remarkable flair for combining social and cultural analysis in the study of gender. She was a real daughter of Berkeley in that respect. Her first book, Disgraceful Matters, The Politics of Chastity in 18th Century China, was based on research into over 800 routine memorials in the Board of Punishment's archives. It was a landmark study of the state-sponsored cult of chastity in the late imperial period. Although the chaste state chastity project had been promoted by various dynasties over the years, it primarily had remained a local phenomenon reflecting elite cultural concerns, and this changed dramatically under the Qing. The chastity cult emerged as a governing dynamic of Qing political culture, evolving into a highly bureaucratized, civilizing project aimed at the moral transformation of the Chinese people. Throughout the 18th century, the Qing inserted itself into daily life through an array of policies designed to promote female virtue, gender separation, devotion to the needs of the patriarchal family, and lifelong widow chastity. And Janet revealed the infinite complexities of the system, a system intended to reduce the number of widow suicides actually exacerbated the problem of chastity martyrdom. A system intended to reinforce orthodox forms of patriarchy actually undermined the autonomous power and authority of male elders in courts of law. A system that historically was understood to have underscored the obligations of a woman to her husband's family, paradoxically enabled her to advance her own sense of personhood. Those are Janet's words. Qing officials found themselves inadvertently leveling the social hierarchies of the public arena in unexpected ways, and the book endures as the best study in English on the chastity cult of the 18th century. It makes important statements about late imperial statecraft while simultaneously offering a richly textured social history of gender and the family. In the publications relating to her second book project, she showed how prominent lineages engaged with the legal system, yes, but she also showed how scandalous cases shaped Chinese attitudes about family obligation, sexual propriety, and social and political duty. As she wrote in an early description of the project, and I quote, "The project begins by reconstructing the architecture of the intimate, the sentiments, social interactions, and economic stresses that textured everyday life within a large elite household at a moment of profound crisis, illuminating contradictions between norms of interaction and the emotions that shaped family practice, individual and family priorities, and patrilineal and conjugal notions of the family. I explore the sources of instability that augured social and ideological change within the family system, even among elites who were explicitly committed to upholding family orthodoxy." In both book projects, for Janet, it was not simply a matter of studying Chinese women's history in the 18th century. That was the agenda of the old social history of addressing history from below in terms of topics of history, as Lynn Hunt termed it. Janet had embarked on a long-term project to understand what it was really like for a Chinese woman to live in and try to shape the patriarchal families into which they had married. She genuinely cared about them and wanted to understand their story before telling it. And I think that is her ultimate legacy. She cared about people, whether they lived 200 years ago or needed today, needed to revive a scholarly society, establish a research center, or or listen to what you had to say about history or the world in general. She was a good friend and colleague, and this is a difficult loss for her family and friends, but it's also a loss for the field of late imperial Chinese history, and I don't know how we will get along without her. Thank you.
It's great to see so many old friends and to meet Janet's family for the first time. We're all here to celebrate Janet's work. My brief was to save personal recollections for this evening, so I'm following my orders as strictly as possible. I'm going to offer a few reflections about Janet's landmark book, The Disgraceful Matters, The Politics of Chastity in 18th Century China. It's a book that I use every year in my teaching. I've used it every year in my teaching ever since it came out in 2004. So Janet was interested in the High Qing state's effort to use law and propaganda to promote an ideal standard of female chastity among the common people, as Melissa mentioned briefly. But she was mainly interested in the unintended consequences of this effort by the Qing state. Female chastity had always been important to Confucian family orthodoxy, but the Qing dynasty's extraordinary promotion of that value via the canonization of chastity heroines and the draconian punishment of crimes against chastity went way beyond anything the previous dynasties had attempted. This exaggerated emphasis on female chastity upset the balance between different dimensions of the normative Confucian family model. In this context, chastity meant the absolute sexual loyalty of a wife to one husband in anticipation of her marriage, during her marriage, and after she was widowed, one husband for life. But in the Orthodox tradition, the core alliance within the family was supposed to be that between fathers and sons, with the key value being filial piety. In other words, the absolute deference and obedience of the younger generation to the older. And filial piety was supposed to trump all other values. Upon marriage, a woman left her natal lineage to join her husband's lineage, and when that happened, the primary focus of her filial piety was supposed to shift to her parents-in-law. As a daughter-in-law, her core mission was to serve them. In this Orthodox vision, this older vision, the family was envisioned not as a collection of living individuals, but rather as an organic stream flowing through time, from the past to the future, through the present generation. And from that point of view, the present generation were placeholders, whose principal duty was to have sons, in order to continue that line of descent unbroken. Indeed, the purpose of marriage itself, including conjugal sexual relations, was not individual egocentric self-fulfillment of a personal or emotional nature, but rather its purpose was to produce descendants in service to parents and ancestors. But the Qing dynasty's unprecedented promotion of chastity as a singular value implied that the alliance between spouses would take precedence over that between generations. This was a great irony, given that the ostensible purpose of the chastity cult was to strengthen that family against the rising threat of predatory rogue males outside the family, which was a manifestation of a mounting social crisis in rural China in the 18th century. The peasant family was understood to be the foundation of the imperial state's social and economic order, with Confucian patriarchy serving to delegate a high degree of authority to fathers in particular. And yet, chastity absolutism might induce a young woman to disobey both her own parents and her in-laws. For example, when a widow or a young woman whose fiancé had died insisted on remaining unmarried in defiance of the wishes of both her natal and affinal elders. We are reminded of the literary cult of Qing, i.e. of romantic and passionate love between spouses based on their aesthetic, intellectual, and emotional compatibility. This literary cult of Qing was celebrated in 16th and 17th century fiction and plays such as The Peony Pavilion, Mudanting, and it became the basis for a rise in companionate marriage. By traditional standards, passion between spouses was a potentially dangerous, destabilizing force within the family for the same reason. It threatened to undermine parental authority by elevating the conjugal bond over that between generations. And indeed, that is one theme of Peony Pavilion, which was banned by the government in both the Ming and the Qing dynasties for this reason. The Qing dynasty did not intend to promote Qing, of course, and yet we can see that that romantic ideal, in a sense, was the flip side of the imperial cult of chastity, in that both elevated and prioritized the conjugal bond in a way that threatened to destabilize the normative ideal Confucian family. We see this destabilization in Janet's many cases of sexual assault, the 丑事, or disgraceful matters of her title. These cases of sexual assault show different people responding to what had happened according to their own agendas. Instead of creating a uniform moral order, Janet argues, The imperial chastity cult provoked a sort of chaos, a kind of individual action on behalf of individual interests. In particular, Janet argues that many ordinary women, including illiterate peasant women, internalized the norms promoted by the Qing state and acted on them based on their own personal experiences and based on their perceptions of their own interests as individuals. In response to the propaganda effort of the state, these women internalized an ideal of moral integrity that became the essence of their individual personhood. This is the term that Janet uses, their ability to 做人. And this sense of personhood that was created by this internalization was both very strong and very fragile at the same time. It was strong in the sense that chastity became a field for women to assert themselves as individuals, even in defiance of patriarchal authority. It empowered women to see themselves as individuals rather than merely as subordinate members of a family hierarchy. But their personhood was also fragile in that it could not survive even the slightest implication of sexual impropriety. Thus, and most controversially, Janet argued that when such women committed suicide in response to a disgraceful matter, it was an act of female agency. Specifically, the kind of female suicide recognized by the Qing dynasty as chaste martyrdom, recognized through canonization and so on. This was a way that for women who had been sexually assaulted or harassed to publicize what had happened to them, often in defiance of family and community pressure. Family and community would prefer this remain quiet. It was embarrassing. And it was a way for them to reclaim their personal integrity by doing so. Thus, Janet writes, quote, "The martyrdom of humiliated women redeemed their chaste reputations in the eyes of the state and their communities, but for the women themselves, suicide, by restoring chastity, was also a profound assertion of personhood," unquote. Such suicide was also, as Janet writes, quote, "an aggressive act," unquote, that served to avenge an offended woman by implicating those who had offended her. And this, I believe, personally, is one of the most convincing parts of her argument about female agency. Under the imperial chastity cult, a woman's martyrdom was rewarded with both canonization for herself, but also with the death penalty for the man whose misbehavior had provoked it. So you had both the propaganda side, the li, you might say, and you had the legal side, the fa. Some of these suicides were clearly scripted, and in my own work I've seen many examples of this, so she's right about this. These cases were clearly scripted, with a woman going in the night to hang herself at the offender's house or to drown herself in his family's well. The discovery of her body in such circumstances made accountability and retribution almost inevitable. It was a way for an offended woman to force her family and community to conform to her wishes when they had refused to do so while she remained alive. But also, an aggrieved woman who killed herself in this manner was expected to become a vengeful ghost who would haunt and curse those who had mistreated her. I've seen one case where a woman actually snuck inside the house of the man who had assaulted her, and she hanged herself from the main roof beam. And if you know your feng shui, this is like a curse on the entire household and its descendants forever. A very profound thing to do. Now, Janet's provocative posing of these arguments makes her book a perennial favorite of my students. In seminars, I pair it with my own first book. I try to set up a dialogue between them, and this always generates a lively and occasionally heated discussion. Janet was not afraid to make provocative and controversial arguments. Her argument about suicide in particular provoked some of the most interesting and heated discussion. But also, Janet's book is beautifully written, and I attribute her mastery of English prose narrative in part to the excellent education she received at our shared alma mater, Swarthmore College. I especially admire how she begins each section of her book with a vivid anecdote from a particular legal case that illustrates the main points of that section. This is beautifully handled as a matter of style. Her book will have a lasting impact in the field of Chinese history, and it will be read for a very long time. I'm going to stop there, but I want to thank you all for coming.
Okay, so I think I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one. Our next speaker is Yili Wu from University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Yili is the author of Reproducing Woman, Medicine, Metaphor, and Childbirth in Late Imperial China. Her publications on society, culture, and the body in late Imperial China have examined breast cancer, medical iconography, forensics, bone setting, the circulation of Chinese medicine in Korea, and Chinese views of European medicine. She's completing a monograph on the history of medicine for injuries and wounds in China, using the subfield of literate medicine to explore how experiences of the material and structural body shape the development of Chinese medical thought. Ili.
Thanks so much. And I really want to thank Wenqinya and Sophie Volpe and also the great work of Xiaojian Ma for arranging all our accommodations and travel and arranging this wonderful space for us to remember our friend and colleague, Janet Theiss. And my remarks today are responding to the charge to explain how Janet's research shaped our own research and to suggest some future lines for the use of her work. And so I thought it might be nice to juxtapose two things that seem to have nothing in common, Janet's work on chastity and my work on bone setting. All right, so I'm going to talk mostly about Janet, but I thought I'd start by showing, right, how broadly significant her work is. And I am jointly appointed in a Department of Women's and Gender Studies as well as history. And so I feel that one of Janet's great accomplishments is to give us a way of thinking about gender, which I try to inculcate in my undergraduate and graduate students. And so I'd like to share some thoughts with you today. First, I'd just like to show you this picture. We're saving our more personal reminiscences for tonight, but because Toby Meyer-Fong could not be here, that's Toby on the far right there. For over 2 decades, Toby and Janet and I shared a room at the annual Asian Association for Asian Studies conference. And she was a fixture in my life and a mentor and kind of a steady presence and a role model for me. And the last text I got from her was her usual jaunty text saying, "Hey, ladies, is it time to book our room yet?" So Janet, you'll be very, very missed. And also, we were assistant professors then. This is about year 3 or 4. Time has flown. Okay, so I spent the last month really agonizing over a 750-word obituary that the American Historical Association asked me to write for Janet. And in thinking what I could squeeze into that very tight space, what I really wanted to talk about was why everyone should read Janet's work and why her work is so important and why the work of historians is so important, especially in our age today where the value of liberal arts and the value of diversity and global studies is increasingly or is continuously under attack. So I wanted to have a few words about what I see as the value of global history. And next month, the American Historical Association is going to have a webinar called The Civic Value of World History. And their point is that if you want to be a good American citizen, and of course, you know, we're in a North American Academy, right? You must know about the world. And indeed, the founding fathers of the United States saw themselves in conversation with the world. And I also wanted to bring this up because a big part of Janet's work was outreach, all right? We've heard people talk about the fact that at the University of Utah, she founded the Center for Asian Studies. She turned it into a Title VI resource center, a huge, huge program. Okay, she was an institution builder. So I want to just review some aspects of Janet's multifaceted career. Going to see if I can expand this so I can see what I'm writing. Okay. So first of all, scholarly discovery and innovation, which I'm going to talk a little more about. She was the consummate scholar, right? Also, public scholarship and institution building. As the head of the Center of Asian Studies, if you look at her CV, She was involved in myriad grant proposals, from hiring a Korean studies professor to a Japanese studies professor to organizing conferences, co-sponsoring proposals for other professors. All right, absolutely huge. And of course, her great service to the field of Qing histories and of Asian studies generally. I'm sorry, is there a way to make this screen bigger on here? I can't quite. On here, I can't read what I've written. Can you make this bigger? I have not used this particular interface before. Sorry, I'm discovering all my limitations. Perfect, thank you. Also, I'm at the age where like you can't read anything and you need like 5 pairs of glasses. No, I'm good. But the other thing that I really wanted to emphasize was Janet's cross-field collaborations. Okay, along with Barbara Maloney and Haywell Choi, Janet co-edited Gender in Modern East Asia, which designed as a classroom resource. Okay, and some of you may know this, but Janet, when she was at Swarthmore, she started off as a European studies student, and it was as a result of her class with Lillian Lee that she was inspired to switch to Chinese studies. And so just from that, you can see how valuable and important it is that we support good teaching about Asia at the undergraduate level. And this is a major contribution that Janet and her collaborators put together. And I also want to mention that they have forthcoming this year the Oxford Handbook of Modern East Asian Gender History. I've seen the table of contents. It's phenomenal. They have 33 contributors. It's a huge project that has finally come to fruition. So I first met Janet when we were both in Beijing doing research. We had both received a grant from the Committee for Scholarly Communication with the PRC. And I briefly met her at an opening reception, was completely intimidated by how smart she was, and didn't see her for the rest of our time in China because we went off in different archival directions. But fortunately, Janet pulled me in on a panel that she was organizing for the Association of Asian Studies conference in 1997, titled Precepts and Practices in Women's Lives in Late Imperial China. And I was reminded of this when I was rereading Janet's book, because she talks about the issue of precepts and practices. And in this panel, I talking about medicine and Brian Dott talking about religion and Janet talking about law, examined the ways in which gender norms were broke down in practice. All right. Now, I wanted to talk about scholarly change and growth, right? There's a big difference between your dissertation and a book. And one of the things that I was really struck by when I was looking at Janet's work again was her deliberate attempt to move away from this older model of practice and precept that we had found so seductive, right, as graduate students. Now, there's a good reason for that. We've heard about how the 1990s was a very exciting time in the cultural turn, but it was also a time when the study of the history of Chinese women was really coming into its own, that a critical mass of scholars was arguing and that you can't just see Chinese women as passive, oppressed victims, which, by the way, is a stereotype that still pervades popular understandings, right, of Chinese women today, all right? That when you have to look beyond the norms to see how they're practiced. Okay, and Janet intentionally joined with this emerging body of scholarship to look at the complexity of the way that gender norms were or were not applied, okay, in women's lives. And so in her book, Disgraceful Matters, she developed this by saying we need to move away from the polarities of practice and precepts by looking at chastity as gender politics. And she said we have to get away from practice and precept, rigidity and fluidity, by highlighting the process through which norms were defined, enacted, enforced, and contested. And what she found, as Matt Sommer so brilliantly and detailedly laid out, was that the meanings of the norms shifted and varied in the midst of policymaking and implementation, adjudication, social conflict, and the ordinary encounters of everyday life, okay? Including the stunning finding, right, that in some cases, the penalty for a man sexually harassing a woman could be higher than the penalty for a man actually raping the woman because of these humiliation suicides. The other theme, as Matt laid out, was the idea of chastity as a source of identity and personhood, okay? And we've heard about women committing suicide, right, as a response to sexual harassment. And now I'm going to shift a little bit and say how I'm using this finding in my own current project. Because what I have found in my project, okay, is women saying that they would rather be disabled than dishonored by having a male doctor touch them. Okay, and I want to again put out a shout out for the Oxford Handbook, which has a big section on how is gender embodied. So the question is, when were men allowed to touch women, and when were male doctors allowed to touch women? And in my work on bone setting, I found that all the records of bone setters I have are men. Okay, but of course women had injuries. And so this is a question that has pervaded the study of gender in medicine, right? To what extent did gender segregation affect the way that women might receive different kinds of healthcare? So I don't have time to go into that today, but I just want to give you a little teaser again to show how Janet's work on chastity is so broadly applicable to so many fields. Okay. So one of the things that happens is that when you set a bone, you have to grab the person's body. And these images come from one of the texts that I'm looking at with a preface dated 1815. And this text is unusual in that the doctor included a lot of visual images of how to set dislocations. So you can see on the left-hand side, they are setting a dislocation in a man, and they are grabbing and pulling his body. Now, doctors like the one I'm studying developed different techniques for treating women who did not want to be grabbed. And in this particular image, he's using a traction rope. And the idea is that he's tapping the rope and lulling the woman and then suddenly yanking the rope, okay, and pulling her dislocated arm back into the socket. A similar thing is at work here in case of hip dislocation recorded by my doctor. So you can see on the left, this is how you might do it in a man. He's lying on the ground, he's exposing his crotch, the doctor has his foot in the man's buttock, okay? You cannot do that to a woman. So one of the methods that this doctor's family developed was, again, to pull the woman's leg with a rope, and then the doctor is pretending he's going to hit her with a really heavy mallet, which causes her to recoil, and the combined force of the traction rope and the recoil will put her hip back into the socket. Now, this is really hard to do. Very, very hard to do, okay? So, and I've seen, biographies, these little gazetteer biographies of bone setters, and it'll say something like, "Oh, women all like to see him because he knew how to use the remote rope traction." Okay, but this is actually very hard to do. Okay, so what happened to the women, right, who could not be treated this way? And this is where I'm thinking about Janet's work, because you have these women who say, "I would rather be disabled than have a male doctor touch me." And I'll just give you two examples. One was the patient of Hu Tingguang, who is the doctor who wrote this book, who had a woman with her arms frozen above her head. And she said, "Absolutely do not touch me. I would rather become deformed." Okay. And another case, this is in a gazetteer biography of a chaste widow, Miss Zhang, who came from a very rich merchant family and married a scholar official, was widowed at age 21. And sometime after that, she broke her left leg. And the gazetteer tells us the doctor wanted to use his hands to press, rub, and join the bone, but the lady was unwilling to allow a man's hand to approach her body, and she preferred to remain disabled. Now, if we have Janet's work, we understand that this isn't just some kind of exaggerated adherence to chastity. We understand that these women aren't just somehow, mentally unstable, right? Like, how could you not want your broken leg to be treated, right? But that in various ways, this is part of a larger culture in which women are asserting their personhood, their control over their own treatment, and asserting the right to judge what is important to them. So finally, I want to conclude by just offering some suggestions for how to extend what I see as an important part of Janet's vision. And her second book manuscript, which was in progress at the time of her passing, touched on 3 topics that I think are very important: gender, identity, and emotion. Okay, because what is filial piety if not a complex set of emotions, all right? And in her work, The Scandal and the Limits of Self-Invention, right? The cult of chastity helps us to understand why this suit that Madame Fay filed, all right, to say, I didn't commit adultery, my brother-in-law is just slandering me, okay? Why did the governor believe that story, okay, and make the magistrate rule in her favor when it was really very sketchy, okay? And also in thinking about gender as politics, all right, Janet offers us an important way of theorizing power and gender, all right, and how gender performance might confer authority and status. And then finally, how can historical findings help us critically examine present-day narratives and gender history? And this is an image from the website of K.N. Johnson's book about the impact of the one-child policy. And I have 2 daughters adopted from China, and I am very familiar with the Chinese throw girls away like trash narrative. Janet's work shows us historically how to create more complex pictures, and through outreach, we can make these narratives reach a broader audience. Thank you very much.
All right, our next speaker is Eugenio Menegon. Eugenio has published extensively on the history of Chinese-Western relations and is the author of 2 books. The first, One Heaven, Giulio Eleni, Geography, Art, Science, Religion, From Europe to China, and the second, Ancestors, Virgins, and Friars, Christianity as a Local Religion in Late Imperial China, which was the recipient of the 2011 Joseph Levinson Book Prize in Chinese Studies. His current book project is an examination of the daily life and political networking of European residents at the Qing court in Beijing during the 17th to 18th centuries. Thank you, Eugenio.
So first of all, I would like to thank Ye Wenxing and all the friends who are speaking today, Sophie, the Center for Chinese Studies, and Janet's family for giving me an opportunity to revisit Janet's scholarship on this occasion, reflect on her influence on my own work, and also recover memories of past encounters with her while studying here at Berkeley, and later on, over the years, especially at festive encounters at the Association for Asian Studies meetings, and at a memorable panel on virginity and chastity in late Imperial China at the AAS annual meeting of New York in 2003. Janet was ahead of me a few years in the program when I took with her a graduate course in early Chinese history taught by David Kitley. I got to know her better during the fall semester of 1993, starting a friendship that was based on admiration as much as on sympathy. As Melissa has mentioned in her remarks, those years saw the cross-fertilization, at times the clash, between social history and new cultural history of Berkeley. My graduate education here was an academic adventure that literally changed my life. I often remember those years as the best ever, full with discoveries and the opening of new horizons. Every course I took here was an exciting, at times exhilarating, at times intimidating foray into new ways of thinking. Both our teachers and our classmates made that intellectual coming of age possible for me. While I arrived in the US from an undergraduate education in Italy, my American classmates hailed from Ivy League schools like Harvard or venerable liberal arts colleges like Swarthmore, the undergraduate alma mater of Janet, where she graduated with high honors under the tutorship of Lillian Lee. And indeed, Janet was one of the smartest colleagues I ever had. My dissertation, later published as my first monograph in English, was a social and cultural history of a special heterodox group, a cluster of Catholic communities in Fujian province from the 1630s to the present day. One of the main actors in those communities were young women who had converted to the new religion from beyond the oceans and who rejected marriage, vowing to remain virgins in the service of their new God, the Lord of Heaven. They were known in Spanish as beatas and in Chinese as zhenyu. I first presented some of my findings on the Catholic virgins of Fujian at the 2003 New York AAS panel that was titled Virgin Bodies, Virginity, Chastity, and the Body in Late Imperial China, that I coordinated with the help of Janet and of Paola Zamperini, with Beverly Bosler as our discussant. And while Paola talked about the representations of virginity and its loss in Qing vernacular fiction, Janet offered a reflection on bodily definitions of virginity and chastity, both in Qing law and in social practice, and how these ideals, the embodiment of virtue for unmarried and married women, respectively, were understood in Qing law, by magistrates, and by ordinary people. I was then preparing an article on the idea of virginity versus chastity in Mingqing China for a 2004 issue of the journal Nanyu, and I relied on Janet's 2002 essay, Femininity in Flux, Gendered Virtue and Social Conflict in the Mid-Qing Courtroom, and on her 1998 dissertation to contrast the ideas of chastity she was examining with my materials on religiously motivated virginity. Janet's dissertation would undergo a partial reorientation when becoming her influential monograph, Disgraceful Matters, in 2004, a book I did not have at my disposal yet at that time. The dissertation, titled Dealing with Disgrace, the Negotiation of Female Virtue in 18th Century China, in her own words, was an attempt to move away from the lives of elite women and examine how norms of female virtue worked in social practice for ordinary people by studying criminal cases that involved infringements of those norms or conflicts over them. Legal cases, she added, offer the only available non-fictional evidence of the social life, values, and opinions of people outside the literate elites. She also made an astute and for me quite significant point about her sources. And here I quote, "The language and structure of routine memorials allow the careful reader to discern points where case participants digress from the magistrate's preferred narrative of a case, or resist his interpretation of their actions and motives. Reading between the lines of edited testimony, one also discovers a great deal of background factual information about things like household structure, social relations between the genders, and the day-to-day habits and work patterns of women and men. She saw legal cases about violent crimes, murders, and suicides of women as a window on ordinary life. And I quote her again, "Looking through the window of a case, we have a view of certain aspects of social life from a particular angle. Circumscribed as it may be, this view is not a distorted one. We glimpse around the edges the larger social and cultural landscape, which is the context for this extreme behavior." Janet's exploration of the social life of non-literate and literate women and her approach to sources, and a very careful reader she was exactly what I needed as inspiration. My own virgins were also minimally literate, daughters or sisters of low degree holders and commoners. But their choice of rejecting marriage appeared to be the exact opposite of Confucian chastity. Janet remarked at our AAS panel that chastity was defined in relation to marriage as sexual loyalty to one husband, and thus virginity per se was not the core female virtue. And yet I could easily see the importance of the mid-Qing discourse on chastity that Janet was studying, together with the discourse of Buddhist celibacy, and even the circumstances of actual violence that my converted women faced for their choices, as ways for the young Catholic virgins of Fujian to find a space of resistance to patriarchy and carve a position for themselves in local society. Unencumbered by marriage, they became, over 3 centuries, part of a network of female consecrated tertiaries under the guidance of a prioress, still remaining in their natal family homes, rather than being forced to join the family of a husband chosen for them. Janet's book, Disgraceful Matters, The Politics of Chastity in 18th Century China, published by UC Press in 2004, and here is my well-worn copy of it, in part reframed her view of the 850 criminal cases she had gathered and directed increased attention to the legal and political dimensions of the Qing civilizing mission. And here I quote her again. This is really the pivoting from the dissertation to the book. Rich as these sources are in details about the lives and views of ordinary women and men, they depict them only at the moment of their interaction with the state. Combine the sources for information about women's lives and the implications of gender norms in practice, one is compelled to pay attention to the Qing state's construction of female virtue and the political context within which officials dealt with sexual assault, spousal homicide, adultery, and female suicide. Janet's analysis had become even more complex and sophisticated, revealing in unprecedented detail the pivotal and explosive importance of female virtue for the patriarchy, the Qing state, and women themselves. A focus on this political aspect of chastity, she argued, moved us away, and we heard this before, from the polarities of practice and precept, rigidity and fluidity that structure much of the analysis of Chinese gender norms, by highlighting the process through which norms were defined, enacted, enforced, and contested. Over the years, I have continued to assign parts of Janet's work to my undergraduate students writing papers on late imperial women. Those students tend to simplify the condition of women in the past as purely victims of patriarchy without real agency or initiative. It is precisely the kind of sources on non-literate women that Janet and others in her generation have used, together with literary production by elite women, that have revealed to us how Chinese society harbored all kinds of unorthodox behaviors, even among women. My students then finally opened their eyes beyond the Confucian prescriptive picture of an allegedly controllable society. To what? To the reality of adulterous wives having their pleasure, strong-willed matrons bending the rules, chaste widows with great financial acumen exacting their due from rapacious men, cuckold husbands accommodating trysts to survive, complicitous lineage elders concerned for local stability and averse to state intrusion, and so on. In my view, this is one of the great contributions of Janet's work, to have opened for us and our students a window on the ordinary life of late imperial women, on their resourcefulness and resilience, even within a state and social patriarchal regime intent on stifling their liberty and dictating their behavior in a complex tension between norm and practice, ideology and lived experience. As she only half-jokingly wrote in her dissertation, chastity is what you make of it. Thank you, Janet, for your insight, humor, and humanity.
Our next speaker is Andrea Goldman. Andrea specializes in the cultural and social history of early modern and modern China, with particular emphasis on the subfields of urban history, performance, the politics of aesthetics, and gender studies. Her book, Opera and the City, The Politics of Culture in Beijing, 1717 to 1900, used opera as a lens through which to observe court and city dynamics in Qing Dynasty Beijing, and won the Joseph Levinson Prize in 2014.
Thank you, and I want to reiterate what others have said. I really appreciate Sophie and Wenxin organizing this. Thank you to, I'm sorry, it just went dark because I put my computer down, Janet's family for letting us celebrate Janet in this way. Okay, actually I don't need that. Okay. I need to be able to see my notes. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the word mensch, and I quote, colloquial, first usage, 1911. In Jewish usage, a person of integrity or rectitude, a person who is morally just, honest, or honorable. Well, I think it's high time that the Oxford English Dictionary update its entry to include the following, and again I quote, i.e. Janet Theiss. Janet was a true mensch. I miss her, and I mourn her all too timely passing from this world as both a friend and a colleague. But of course, we come here today not just to grieve, but to celebrate Janet, and to think about the ways in which her insights and approaches to Chinese history have shaped our own scholarship. But first, I want to take a little trip down memory lane to the days when we were both here at Berkeley. During my years at Berkeley, there were a handful of us who chose, to use Joan Scott's term, gender as a category of analysis, including Susan Glosser, who's here, Janet, myself, and over in ALC, Paolo Zamparini, and Sang Zilan, who's here as well, and probably others who I've forgotten to mention, so I apologize if I've left anybody out. And then there were those who, perhaps inadvertently, ended up working on the history of women, including Eugenio, who you've just heard from, working on his virgins. And also Qitao Guo, who wishes he could be here today but can't, each in their own way, working on grassroots religion, respectively. They had to grapple with women devotees of the Catholic cult of Mary, so reminiscent of the figure of Guan Yin, in rural Fujian, or in the case of Qitao, the promotion of the chastity cult via dissemination of Mulian opera in rural Huizhou. Now, Melissa incorporated gender into her analysis in her wonderful second book, Distant Shores, Colonial Encounters on China's Maritime Frontier. Now, none of our mentors worked on these topics at the time, at least, but that was the Berkeley way, so to speak. There was never a Berkeley school, but I think there was a Berkeley way. Now, back as cynical graduate students, we used to joke with each other about being the latchkey graduate students, have to let ourselves in, do all this sort of stuff. But I've come to realize in hindsight what a blessing that was. Berkeley didn't produce mini-me's. And I assume that's still the case today. It's certainly something I carry into my own philosophy as a mentor of graduate students. So with that as a kind of preamble, I want to turn now to inspirations and synergies between Janet's work and my own. I started out with two, but now I'm thinking, after hearing everyone else speak, there's a third one too that I'll just extemporize on. Janet's work was bold. In Disgraceful Matters, she took the oldest trope in the world about poor, victimized Chinese women under Chinese patriarchy, forced to commit suicide, and turned it on its head. And I often, like Matt, sort of teach her book along with Matt's first book, and that generates all kinds of great discussion. But I also often teach Janet's book with Marjorie Wolf's article on women and suicide, and the sort of article that starts the whole concept of the uterine family and so forth in the field. But in any case, so she takes this and turns it on its head. Now, Janet didn't lead with theory. Her work was deeply grounded in the archive, but she used the archive to come to a new conceptualization about the connections between state legitimacy, the chastity cult, and women's agency in 18th century China. I don't recall Janet ever formally invoking the late James Scott's weapons of the weak in her monograph, but that phrase, weapons of the weak, has been bouncing around a lot in my head recently as I think about how to characterize Janet's work. Her study of women's suicide as an agentic act in 18th century China was, in a sense, a study of the weaponization of suicide by young women to assert their integrity and personhood in Qing China in the face of inaction by both lineage elders and the state. It was these women who demanded that the state carry through on its Confucian rhetoric. And when such women felt they'd been harassed or slighted, they knew that through suicide, they would be forcing the hand of the state to secure redress. Janet's penchant for finding agency in unexpected places animates some of my own research. In fact, one of my own ongoing book projects, which is a study of urban gossip in China circa 1780 to 1920. Gossip, I suggest, was a means by which those with little in the way of power might censure those who abused their power and position for pleasure or for profit. I moved through different genres of texts, casual jottings or BG by men of letters, history plays, which are received by audiences not as history, but as commentary on present-day individuals, the fan literature about the young boys who cross-dressed to play female roles on stage, which became so prevalent in the late 18th century through the 19th century, novels read as roman à clef, and so on. Now, a portion of this research is first going to come out as an essay in a joint project that Matt Sommer and Tina Liu and I are working on, in which I read the mid-19th century novel Pinghua Baojian as commentary on abuse of boy actresses by men with power, and also pair that with ballads in the signature Manchu Zidishu style for their caustic commentary on Manchu princes, Manchu sort of prince playboys who get apprehended for rape and other criminal acts and societal violations. A second synergy with Janet's work crystallizes around the theme of masculinity. In her essay Explaining the Shrew, Narratives of Spousal Violence and the Critique of Masculinity in 18th Century Criminal Cases, this is in a conference volume called Writing and the Law in Late Imperial China, Janet aptly illustrates Joan Scott's observation that writing about women is always also about its conceptual dyad of men. And indeed, she shows that Qing jurists blame the problem of so-called shrewish wives as much as on what they perceived as a failure of men to uphold proper patriarchy as it was the fault of the women themselves. And indeed, Janet's concept of failed patriarchy is further elaborated in the work of her former MA student, Stephanie Painter, who then went on to receive a PhD in Chinese history from the University of Chicago, whose entire dissertation is centered on the problem of male heads of households failing to meet the expectations of their normative social roles. They are drunk half the time, they gamble, they can't perform in bed, and so on. And so the wives have had enough, and they end up killing these husbands, and then it ends up in court cases. Now, this in some ways sort of has certain synergies with my own work on the construction or reconstruction of masculinity in China, although my work on that project is moving into the first half of the 20th century, moving out of the Qing. So my second ongoing book project, The Frenchman and the Chinese Opera, Imperialism, Homoeroticism, and Transnational Masculinities, examines the construction or reconstruction of modern masculinity in China in the first half of the 20th century as viewed through the lives of four men. Chapter 1, currently titled Literary Appropriation and the End of Homoeroticism in China, focuses on Georges Soulier, situating his adaptation of the mid-19th century novel Pinhua Baojian and his in situ observations about the radical reordering of commercial sex work in post-1900 Beijing within fin de siècle French sinology and literary trends, in the process showing that the reconstruction of masculinities was mutually constituting. China and the Orient, in quotation marks more broadly, became a site for imagining alternative masculinities among French Sinophile writers, Pierre Loti, Soulier himself, Victor Segalen, and so forth, even as foreign incursion in China reshaped Chinese attitudes about homoeroticism in the opera demi-monde. I won't go on too much more about this book project, but just to say that I think throughout all of my research, and I think everyone here has spoken to this, the way in which Janet teased out or sort of problematized precept and practice, I often think about it in terms of sort of prescription and description. And I think my book 2 tried to do a lot to say there's all this stuff that we think we know about the sort of Confucian norms and prescription, but what happens if we look at society at the level of actual description, what people were doing, and what's the kind of tension or that dialectic between prescription and description. So this search for agency in unsuspecting places, the interest in masculinity, the interest in problematizing prescription and description in Janet's work has been a constant inspiration to me in my own scholarly agendas. I'm going to miss her voice and her shining light in the field. And in closing, let me reiterate that, again, I've said Janet was a bold and creative historian. She was a true mensch, and her all too sudden passing is a loss for the field of Qing history. It's also a personal loss for me. I'm going to miss her wit, her acumen, and her friendship. And I think the only way to move beyond the sadness is to try to emulate the wonderful person she was and her kind of innovation as a scholar as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Our next speaker is Paola Zamparini. Paola was recruited to Northwestern University in 2013 as the founding chair of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, where she built a fully staffed department of faculty and instructors in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean in record time. She's published extensively in the fields of late Imperial Chinese literature and gender and sexuality studies. Her forthcoming book is entitled Sinopornologies, Writing Sex in Early Modern Chinese Fiction. Welcome, Paula.
So I would like to begin today, of course, thanking Madame Ye. Thank you so much for bringing us all here. And of course, Sophie, Janet's family. We love you because you gave us Janet. So I don't know how to log in, sorry. But I also want to say that Ye Wenxin was very clear with us that we should speak to the intellectual contributions and legacy of Janet. And I really struggled with that because it's very hard for me to parse my personal encounter as a graduate student of Janet from my engagement and her engagement in with our respective scholarly trajectories. So once the PowerPoint becomes accessible, I will show you some pictures that are very personal, but I will not tell you why we're laughing in those pictures. That's for later tonight, I promise. But I also want to really show you how I wouldn't have been able to become an academic in a foreign country with what I realize now at the time was really broken English. I didn't know then. When I got here, I thought my English was fantastic. I don't know about you, Jenny, but it was like so great. First seminar with David Johnson taught me that my English was really terrible. So I wouldn't be here with all of you without Janet. And that is something, thank you very much, that I think it needs to be said. You look at this impressive, amazing list of institutional, professional tasks that she did at the national, international level. And that is what led me to be insane enough to accept the position of founding chair of anything, and also keeps leading me to do service, including directed gender and sexuality studies now at Northwestern. What was I thinking? I was thinking of Janet and the standards she'd set, not only for herself, but for all of us as scholars, among other things, of gender and sexuality studies. And so, in a way, I do want to tell you things that will come across as personal, but they're actually really foundational for the field. And whereas we work on so many topics, so for example, this is an anthology that I co-edited, in which Janet published her very first article, which is a foundational article, I think. There was so much more to us and to our relationship. And now I read, because I'm such a baby that if I keep talking, I will cry, so bear with me. Whenever I think of how I met and came to know Janet, two images appear simultaneously in my mind's eye. The first is of Janet sitting on the cheap and incredibly uncomfortable futon in my very first Berkeley dwelling, a tiny ground floor studio apartment near Telegraph Avenue, parenthesis, where Melissa used to live until she graduated from UC Berkeley, close parenthesis. It was kind of a dump, yes. Her head bent down, Janet is quietly reading a short story I had written shortly after arriving in California in August 1992, entitled The Berkeley Samurai. I watch her in silence, feeling nervous, but mostly, though I do not yet understand it at the time, deeply honored that she would take my fiction seriously enough to spend nearly an entire day reading it and discussing it with me. The sun shines behind her, setting her hair ablaze in a golden halo, like one of Piero della Francesca's angels. I will never forget her words when she finally breaks the silence and begins to speak. Her thoughts on my work as a fiction writer are not important here. Also, they were not very flattering. So. What matters is that this moment is why, whenever I think of Janet, her face is invariably suffused with the warm, bright light of that fall day 34 years ago. The second scene takes place on campus. We're sitting next to each other in our Japanese for Sinologist class. And for those of you who had to take it, it wasn't easy, because nobody really wanted to take it. We wanted to read our Chinese language materials. So as our instructor delivers in a kind but relentless monotone, a ceaseless stream of instructions in Japanese, Janet and I sigh, roll our eyes, and shake our heads with impeccable and entirely spontaneous synchronicity. Startled, we look at each other in instant recognition, first smiling and then bursting out laughing. Yes, we were rude, and our teacher was not particularly amused, though in her irrepressible kindness, she did not scold us or kick us out of the class. Light and laughter were and continue to be the medium through which Janet has inhabited my heart and my life for decades now. Reading, studying, writing, in and outside of class, attending talks, chatting, walking around campus, gossiping about our professors, of course. This is how we became and remained friends during the years we overlapped Berkeley. During graduate school, we shared meals and bus rides, worries about coursework, relationships, and job prospects. I was never, and still am not, convinced that I, a first-generation university student, would ever be smart enough to have a career as an academic in the United States. Janet would have none of it, none of my insecurities, and often literally laughed me out of the room. Didn't feel very nice at the time, but I think she was right. And when I needed encouragement or simply a smile, she was somehow always there, generous to a fault with her time, and with explanations about everything that did not make sense to me, from how to navigate the challenges of a UC Berkeley graduate education, or why dangling gerunds do not belong in a graduate seminar essay. And remember, this was before ChatGPT, so we didn't have those tools. Over time, however, our graduate training led us in different directions. We were not in the same departments, so full disclosure, I am not an historian, not even a closeted one. So, and my love for Min and Chin fiction deepened also through my conversations with Janet. But as this was happening, my department descended into a kind of maelstrom of interesting but disruptive chaos. Things became so dysfunctional that it went into receivership. Faculty left, including my own wonderful dissertation advisor. And Andrew, you were there to witness that, so we still bear the scars. And I began to fear I would never finish my dissertation. By comparison, Janet's training in her chosen discipline and her path through the history department seemed at the time for more linear and smoother, at least, of course, from my outsider's perspective. I felt then, as I often did later, that Janet's disciplinary identity as an historian functioned at times like a kind of magic shield, rendering her less vulnerable to the epistemological confusion and solitude I experienced. I think this is why Janet and I, who had bonded over a deep love and commitment to gender studies in early modern China, eventually diverged in how we approach research in our respective fields. I grew increasingly uncomfortable with the philological approach centered by my ELC teachers, especially when thinking through representations of sexuality and gender in pre-modern Chinese literature. I also felt that the genres my professors emphasized, especially poetry, nothing against poetry, John, but not my thing, sorry. The genres that my professors emphasized were not the only or even the primary sources in which I would find the answers I sought. And so I searched elsewhere, high and low, and was fortunate enough to land in the very first cohort of the designated emphasis program in what was then called the Women's Studies Department, now Gender, Women, Sexuality Studies Department. This required me to delay my qualifying exams to take what felt at the time like an overwhelming number of additional courses in feminist theory and sexuality studies. And thus, while I had found a new intellectual home, along with new allies and mentors, I saw less of Janet. Then she moved to Utah, and that somehow we continued to find ways to collaborate. And Passionate Women was one of these examples, and then the panel on virginity, and there were many other such collaborations. My life choices eventually took me away from the United States. Unsure that I wanted to remain in the country, I accepted the postdoctoral positions at Academia Sinica. Later, as Janet began the work of creating new curricula in Chinese history and gender at Utah, a project that became a lifelong commitment to service in Chinese studies, Asian studies, and gender and legal studies, both at her institution and nationally, I took a job in Portugal. For a long time, we kept traveling in different directions, and yet we always found a way to make time for each other, at least for the AAS, at least to share a meal, at least to have a drink, or two, or three. Over the years, as we grew older and became first more involved, or even more involved, I should say, in, and then increasingly burdened by difficult and at times impossible administrative responsibilities, our conversations often turned towards those professional challenges, conversations that inevitably intersected with lost sleep, lost hope, and sadly, at times, the loss of loved ones. This is why the final memory I want to share today centers on a very difficult conversation Janet and I had more or less in 2019. We had both grown weary and disillusioned with the institutions where we worked. I struggled to see the purpose, especially for feminist scholars like Janet and me, of continuing to, and I quote, use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, to cite Audre Lorde. My lifelong commitment to literatures and cultures in Chinese, as well as gender and sexuality studies, had given me many words to express my discomfort, heartbreak, and unease, but so very little actual agency to effect real change. It was not enough. I told Janet we needed to do more and better to dismantle our collective complacency and complicities with unequal hierarchies and entrenched power structures in higher education. I argued for a stronger commitment to rejecting white-stream feminism, all forms of normative gatekeeping in our respective fields, and to destroy the illusion that equality is an attainable goal within the supposedly meritocratic North American university system. As always, Janet listened. She offered strong counterpoints to my arguments. One of the arguments was that I wanted everyone to be trained in feminist studies and sexuality studies. And she said, I've never trained as a feminist scholar. I am a feminist. So that's where we spar. And spar we did. It wasn't easy. But as always, Janet listened. She shared harrowing stories of her own experiences, moments when the feminist tools she thought she had acquired and mastered failed her. We cried, we compared scars, and in the end, we laughed together because somehow we had managed not to agree on almost anything we had discussed. Yet that remains one of the most important conversations of my life to date. Janet, as she had done so many times before and would do again, sat with me, saw me, and most important of all, showed me fearlessly, generously who she was. An intelligent, dedicated, passionate woman, a scholar, a teacher, a mentor, a friend, my friend. Thank you. And if you're at the AAS, this is the second celebration, and I say this, and I apologize for taking more time, but I say this for those of you who will be there and also for her family. So some of the people who are here will be in Vancouver, but Stephanie Painter, her student, Maram Epstein, another collaborator and friend, Haywal Chu, the outgoing president of the Association of Asian Studies, will also be there. So you're also welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Our last speaker is Wenxin Ye, Janet's dissertation advisor and mentor. Wenxin is the Richard H. and Laurie C. Morrison Chair Professor and Distinguished Professor of History here at Berkeley. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Wenxin is the author of Shanghai Splendor, Economic Sentiments and the Making of Modern China, 1843 to 1949, Provincial Passages, Culture, Space, and the Origins of Chinese Communism, 1919 to 1927, and The Alienated Academy, Culture and Politics in Republican China, 1919 to 1937. Thank you, Wenxin.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, especially members of the family, for being here. So as you can see, I've been around. I've been here continuously for some time. And at this very setting, namely in the faculty club, for comparable events along these lines, I've attended more than one, believe me. We usually follow the kind of format that pathetically we have all adopted and applied on ourselves as well as on each other. Namely, you speak of somebody in terms of research, teaching, and service, the three categories by which our academic merit system is constructed. And yet, this evening, it's different. We talk about teaching, service, and research. And yet, in addition to that, we talk about friendship, we talk about fond memories, we seek to bring back memories of our own time together with Janet. So why is that different? That is, in terms of the texture of formulaic events such as this. I suppose it's the person who has observed Janet for quite some time, even though I did not have the opportunity to interact with her the way that many speakers did. I should say that it was because Janet, as a person, she was very special. She had special qualities, as Susan, I'm sure, can remember. Namely, from day one, upon arrival at Berkeley, she impressed upon me with her acute interest in people who seem ill at comfort in this world, a world which had not been built for them. In other words, she was determined to poke fun minimally, if not to burst the bubble of people who seem too comfortable, too sure of their own place at the center of the universe. So the way that she expressed, articulated, or actualized this agenda, her first projects were actually not the 18th century. Her first seminar paper was on Songjiaoren, women's voting rights in the early Republican period, and the highlight of that paper was how Songjiaoren was slapped in the face by Kang Youwei's daughter in a dispute over women's voting rights. Her second paper was actually on Zhu Yuanzhang's wife, that is, that very famous wife for whom Zhu Yuanzhang would murder. And this woman, upholding all the virtues of being empress of the empire and paragon of virtue, and a woman of humble origin, was able actually, when she was the one and only person capable of containing her peasant tyrant husband. It was after her death that he went berserk and started killing people left and right. So those were Janet's first two projects before she landed on the dissertation project. So what did she do then? She moved across a whole range, as been mentioned in all the presentations. Law, ritual, practice, and ultimately it's about norm. So as I think about Janet's research focus, she's always interested in the placement of a gendered subject in a normed universe or normed order in a world that had not been designed or made for them. And she tells the story with glee about how impishly, ingeniously, such women or such gendered subjects had a way to get what they wanted. So at the risk of being indiscreet, I should say, since Andrea mentioned graduate students, roaming around on their own. Of course, I was a product of that style of schooling, and Melissa and I, for instance, we actually shared a dissertation advisor, right? So Janet and I got to know each other when I first made that transition from being a former graduate student, PhD student, to a brand new assistant professor in the department. And I should tell you, it was like walking through a trap door, and all of a sudden you realize that this department that you thought that you knew was a completely different place. So within that context, I should say that I find in Janet not a student, less a student, more a companion, or a bit of a comrade, shall we say, for the kinds of project that she delivered in the end. For any one of you who have read Professor Wakeman's famous piece about 3 generations of martyrdom from the Manchu period to the Qing transition, from Ming to Qing, a single family, 3 generations of martyrdom, and how that patriarchy and orthodoxy sustained dynastic transition. One would have to wonder what Janet was thinking, that is, presenting the type of thesis to somebody who actually had written about the opposite. So, since I won't take time to elaborate on any of these points, since we will have opportunities in the future to continue thinking about Janet's scholarship, I would only say that Janet made a strong impression on me with the way that she carries an impish smile, with twinkle in her eyes, and engaging in, shall we say, interesting exchanges with Professor Wakeman, to the point that our dear Fred found himself at loss of words. So, and then apart from that, speaking of Professor Wakeman, of course, we, among the occasions of this sort that we've held at this very site was commemoration of Professor Wakeman. But this one, that is our gathering here to remember Janet's work and her legacies, it's different for me in the sense that this is about our celebration through Janet of a community of learning, a community of research. It's about what generations or cohorts of us coming together to build that sense of shared intellectual commitment. And Janet is Janet been Janet, and having done all the research, teaching, and service, she contributed enormously, as the speakers have already articulated, to the field, to the profession, and in service to her students, in service to her colleagues, and at this very moment, it's about leaving behind a legacy of scholarship. So on top of the memories that we share, we cherish about her, I would hope that we continue to cultivate or continue to develop the kind of, to pose problems about the sorts of issues that she found difficult, and she found what she found urgent. That is, this is an occasion not just about looking back to how we had been once upon a time. It's also an occasion for us to think ahead about what we could do, we might do next, as a way to remember Janet. So she was among us once upon a time. She made a difference. We remember that difference, and we would like to carry on along the lines that she had suggested. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for being here, for sharing this moment, for sharing this opportunity as the Center for Chinese Studies enabled the creation of this platform, which I hope will continue to be utilized. Thank you.